I'm very excited to introduce you to Christopher Dix, Head of Technology Transformation at the BBC, and Alex Kondov, Tech Lead at Financial Times. Chris is experienced in technology design, product development, delivery, strategy, and leadership. A career spanning over 20 years, his specialties lie in the media and entertainment industry. Alex helped modernize the technical estate of the company's niche magazines and hosting all of the company's content. Thank you very much, Chris and Alex, for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking time to do this. So, recent developments have altered customer behavior about I don't know, in many industries. Yeah, but some industries have suffered more than others. If we look at this specific industry, what has changed? Are there new trends you see? You're taking this, and maybe Alex, we can start with what you think.
Sure. Well, let's go back a year and a half. People were just hearing about this new virus situation going on in China, and there was a lot of inconsistent media coverage, and people just wanted to make sense of everything that was happening. There were many people that were dismissing the situation, and there were others that were escalating it to the point of panic. And the more serious the situation got, the more people needed a reliable source of information. They needed a place where they can get unbiased and fact-checked information that they can use to make decision in the unstable environment that we found ourselves in. What we saw then was that the more serious the situation got, the more our subscribers and reader count grew. I even had friends who are not in the finance industry at all, but they decided to sign up for the FT in order to read the coronavirus coverage. I'm not really sure if this qualifies as a trend. Maybe it's just a normal human reaction, but you get news from everywhere nowadays. So websites, social media, friends. But to get insights into what is going on, to really get an understanding of the world around you, especially in difficult and challenging times, you need a reliable source of information. And despite all the clickbait and all the sensationalism that is going on, and in crisis, people still rely on proven media. Maybe if I can summarize this in one sentence, it's in difficult times, the most important currency is information. Chris, what do you think?
Totally agree with you. To echo everything that you say, I think that from different types of content, so different types of content are also sort of due to COVID and others have just accelerated our timelines. So scale is something we're having to deal with more than ever. I mean, if you look at the England versus Croatia match the weekend, we hit a new iPlayer viewing record. It's 3.9 million views of the match. I think generally what's happened in the last 18 months is just accelerated the move to cloud-based technologies and infrastructure. Which was always going to happen. I mean, especially when we look at things like media transformation and workflow orchestration. We're seeing lots of use cases where legacy on-prem systems are being moved to cloud. Some of it sort of lift and shift. Other it leveraging cloud technology. Others looking at multi-cloud. I mean, there's definitely, in terms of a trend, we're always seeing more and more media companies moving infrastructure to the cloud. I think COVID has accelerated that. I think it was always going to happen, but now the timelines have now been compressed, and we're basically being forced to move in that direction, which I think was always the ultimate goal. I think, especially with a lot of the remote working as well now, and just making sure that we've got access to all the tools and different working practices that allows us to work in the way that we need to work in these different modes of working.
You mentioned working remote. Has perhaps cybersecurity increased a little bit, or do you think that companies were able to, do what they had to do in order to make remote work?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly from our perspective at the BBC, we've had to scale things like single sign-on, access to all of the tooling that we need. And we've been really lucky that we've been able to respond to it. I've noticed with other colleagues in other companies, especially things like production, post-production, they've had to basically move from physical production suites into virtual production suites, and it's been quite successful on the whole, from what they told me. So it's a lot of the scaling complexities seem to be dealt with quite well.
Would you share the same opinion like Chris, Alex?
Yeah, I agree. Like, we were really remote friendly even before the pandemic, even before everyone had to work remote. We all had the option to do it, but as Chris said, when we all had to, like, we had to scale some of our services, we had problems with our VPN connections at first because too many people were trying to use that. But yeah, I think we managed to pull through relatively quickly, and it just escalated the transition.
That's good to hear. I think 2 weeks ago, I was talking to Zalando and Marcis about similar topics, and I was wondering, as they are in e-commerce retail, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the infrastructure for media outlets differ from other industries. Like, does it differ a lot? What do you think, Chris?
I think that the problems are fundamentally all the same. I mean, you look at, there's always a question of security and access to systems and content. I think maybe specifically in the media industry, certainly from an operational perspective, we're moving really large files around. So that's probably sort of one of the difference. So, we've got things like, and it's sort of no real different to any other companies. It's just, I suppose it's slightly different with large files. We're running things like, in some companies, running sort of follow the sun workflow processes. We're being, I suppose, hit with things like lower margins on work. So we're having to look at different optimizations. So there's, I think a lot of the problems are very similar. I think in the media industry, sometimes we like to think we're a bit special, but they're all the same problems that everyone else is having. We talk about doing things like visual effects rendering in the cloud and those sorts of things, but these sort of scaling problems are, the same scaling problems for other companies. I suppose with the pandemic hitting and lots of people, as Alex was saying, wanting reliable access to content, people streaming video. I think some of those scaling complexities just had to be dealt with a lot quicker than we thought we would have to deal with, I suppose.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think fundamentally we're all facing the same problems, and media companies, like internally, most media companies have a variety of tools and products and services that they deal with. It's not just the media websites that reach the end user. But whenever I think of infrastructure, I think of what is the problem it is trying to solve and what can we get away with. Like, whenever we build software, we build it to solve a specific problem, and the infrastructure mimics this. And maybe I can share a couple of approaches that we've used successfully. As you can imagine, one of our biggest problems is scaling. There are a lot of users that flock to our websites at 9 a.m. each morning, and our infrastructure is focused on alleviating this issue with withstanding the high read volumes. I'm talking about the websites like ft.com in particular, and there's a lot going on in order to solve this problem, but the two approaches I find most fascinating are something called microfrontends and our robust caching mechanism. Now, microfrontends is a technique that FT adopted really early. It's still relatively new and it's not that mature, but it means that every page is deployed independently and it can scale independently. It's its own service, and you can imagine that our homepage, for example, and article pages get a lot more traffic than the subscription one, for example. And then there's also caching. No matter what you see, the content on media websites is not that dynamic, and it doesn't change every minute. So that allows us to cache more heavily, and we've implemented a pretty robust mechanism to have granular control over our caching. Each request that comes is enriched, and we have a better cache hit ratio because of that. In peak times, like around 9 a.m. in the morning, we managed to serve maybe 90% of the requests from the cache. There's an excellent article on Medium. It's called "What Happens When You Open FT.com," and it goes into great detail. If someone is interested, I can talk about this afterwards.
Okay. Now, you kind of said that we have the same sort of problems like all the other industries, but maybe you could be a bit more specific when it comes to the key challenges you're currently facing. And you don't have to refer necessarily to COVID, maybe just in general, the times we live in. Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, I think generally when we think about scale as a challenge, I think in a big organization, well, actually any size organization really, we need to sort of consider the technologies we're using to scale and to start to think about how we're joined up on that, because I think it's very easily to forget it's very easy to not be cost aware with some of these. We've got the changes in the things that we can do now. We can scale dramatically, and it's great, but there's a cost to doing that. And I think that can be a real issue if you're just given access to this vast array of compute, and you can just have nearly unlimited scale. We've got to have the right checks and balances in place to ensure that we can control that cost. Also, around security, it is to make sure that security models, things like threat modeling and those sorts of things, are independently verified, I suppose, when we're pushing solutions out the door, so that we have a joined up and a consistent way of challenging designs and things that we've got, so that we're being as security conscious as possible and not just trying to get things out the door as quick as we need to. And then just generally access control. We've got all different sorts of people working on, whether it's development, it could be contract resources, suppliers, and just making sure that we've got the right level of access control to tooling, things like distribution activities, stuff like that. And I think they're some of the key challenges we face. But also dealing with choice as well, because using cloud capabilities comes with a huge amount of choice. So in a big organization, it's great to innovate, but when we come down to sort of operational deployment, it's good to have some consistency in the tools and the capabilities that we use, even alignment around architecture. They can deal in organizational challenges when actually technology is sometimes the easy bit. It's the organizational challenges around deploying technology and keeping it aligned and keeping it consistent, while still embracing innovation is I think it's quite a significant challenge.
Interesting. Chris already mentioned scaling security and other challenges. Is there any other challenge that maybe he didn't mention, or would you like to go on something that he already said?
Maybe I can talk about two things that I have been fighting with in the past few years. One of them is related to product development, a seemingly simple topic. Everybody knows how to build applications, and people know how to build services, but how do you do it in a way that is maintainable and extensible for years to come? We're often stuck in an endless cycle of rewriting every couple of years, but I don't think this is the ideal way to go. And every large company has many usually more than one product. Like we have multiple websites, multiple media websites. ft.com is like the flagship, the face of the organization, but we've got medias like The Banker or Investors Chronicle. They've really got a lot of potential, but in order for them to truly excel, they need to have the proper architectural and infrastructural backbone behind them. We need to be able to build in such a way that will allow the business to add features and experiment faster. A few years ago, when I was just starting out, it was normal for you to deploy like once a quarter, once a month, or something like that. Well, now you have to deploy daily. That's the norm. But this is really hard when you have to deal with rigid legacy code bases. So how do you make sure that you keep everything up to date? This has been a real challenge for me in the past few years, and we have been like basically taking legacy products and making sure that we can automate their deployments, create short-lived test environments, add feature flags, just to unlock the ability for the business to iterate faster and test new things. And after all, the limitations of a business is the limitations of their software. Maybe another point of view is about data, but not related to user data or behavioral data or anything like that, but the content, the data that the media itself generates. You can imagine that most media websites share a ton of articles each day, and if you can go back and take historical insights, statistical insights from those articles and the information in them, you can find things like connections between topics, mentions, companies, and people. And I think there's a lot of value in this. We're still exploring this. It's still in an early phase, but yeah, it has a lot of potential.
Something that we're looking at as well. Actually, it's I think there's a huge amount to gain on there's things like simple tagging and stuff around topic generation is useful, but I think that even though using some of the sort of machine learning techniques to extract knowledge from our content and create these, you might call them a content graph or something, to then present different ways of presenting onward journeys and different ways of search and discovery. I think it's the likes of Google, they're doing that. Very broad, probably not very specialist, and probably quite not as may not be into our use cases, I think, because they're very, very broad. But yeah, that's the one that's we're starting to explore work around that, especially when you have, I think it's very prominent when you have, like I suppose at the BBC, you've got a whole bunch of domains, content in different domains, where you've got news, sport, you've got TV, you've got education. There's all sorts, but the knowledge that's contained within them is, you can have this you should be able to have this sort of horizontal way of cutting through the information, and so it's not really, I suppose it's not really within one domain. We should be able to go across all domains quite easily. And there's one other thing I forgot to mention, actually, in terms of challenges, is technology and architecture transparency. It's one of the challenges that we've been looking at recently, and is having this view of our whole technology estate, where you find that some teams may just manage things locally. I think that's a general problem in a lot of organizations. But having that overview of your technology and architecture estate is another key challenge that we've certainly come across.
There's something that Alex mentioned and got my attention with regards to tech debt. I think tech debt is something that exists in any industry, and I was wondering how you tackle it. Like, do you have someone who's, I don't know, in charge of looking into it on a daily basis, so to say, or is it like everyone is I don't know, maybe giving 20% of their time to look at tech debt and 80% of developing new apps and so on? Or how do you I don't know, how do you address this issue of the tech debt? Maybe Chris, you can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult. Well, first of all, you've got to understand what tech debt you're maintaining, and having visibility of that, and also understanding what's the usefulness of that system that you're maintaining. So I think sometimes it's difficult just to turn things off and have a strategy that allows you to migrate from one to the other to reduce technical debt. You also need to have, an evolving architecture that allows you to sort of, refresh these capabilities, swap in different capabilities. But I think really the main thing is understanding when it's time to switch things off. I think sometimes there are things that just run and run and run and run, because it might have been a good idea 10 years ago just to do this thing, and it was a temporary thing that stuck for 10 years, but it's still being maintained. Also, one of the other challenges you have around tech debt is just generally the knowledge of how things work. Sometimes we only document things when people leave the company. And so, in worst case, someone leaves the company and the knowledge leaves with them. So there's this sort of avoidance of turning anything off because you don't know what the knock-on effect is going to be. So I think there's sort of regular reviews of why we're doing things, what value do they bring, and to help us work out what things we should be maintaining. We can have systems that are 10, 15 years old, and we shouldn't assume that that's just a whole bunch of tech debt if they're managed in the right way and refreshed regularly. Even when things like, when technologies change, the huge range of technologies that we have to deal with, sometimes we start losing skills. So we have to keep a track of the skills that we need to maintain these systems and maintain this tech debt. So there's a whole bunch of factors, I think, in terms of how we manage tech debt that we need to concern ourselves with. And do you know what? It's not exciting. It's not fun. It's not shiny. But it's something that we need to do, because I think you can also easily basically paint yourself into a corner and not do anything new because you're just keeping the lights on. So there's an incentive there is to keep on top of these things, so we can start to we can start to focus on new innovative things whilst keeping tech debt to a minimum.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. When we talk about tech debt, it's important to say exactly what it is. Sometimes, like tech debt is a tool. Tech debt is something that should be used strategically. Like when you take on tech debt, you knowingly take a shortcut in order to release faster or to make a demo or for some purpose. Like this is something that you do consciously. Now, creating a mess or ending up with an imperfect design is not really tech debt, at least in my understanding. Like when I take tech debt, when I have to reach a deadline, I usually document the shortcut that I've had to take. Like I will say I will do this and that in order to accomplish what we have agreed on, but then it will have to be addressed. A good way to track this is just to immediately create a ticket and put it in the backlog and say, this is not ideal, this needs to be taken care of. This is a good way to just keep visibility on those little problems, because otherwise they pile up. And most code bases don't fail because of one big bug or one big problem. They become a mess because of 1,000 small different mistakes that just pile up with time. And how do you address this? I don't think anyone has it figured out, but maybe. What can I say? It's a natural part of the software development process. It's like writing. You don't end up with the final book in a single with the first draft, and you often don't know what the abstractions are going to be. You don't know what the ideal abstractions, classes, layers, and everything is going to be on your first run through. Sometimes you have to build it. You have to see your problems, and then you have to rebuild it again with those things in mind. And we also have to keep in consideration the fact that the business environment changes. Sometimes you start building something, and then your product manager comes up and says, "Hey, we decided to abandon this feature. We decided, like the business decides to shift, and then this has to be reflected in the design. Not often do you have the time to do this immediately, and this leads to problems. So it's just continuous refactoring. That should be a part of the process. I don't think that we have it nailed down. That's that's what I can say in summary.
I think nobody does. Okay, let's move on to the new question. So what features or services do you use that you do not see with on-premise or self-managed alternatives? Maybe, Alex, you can start this one.
Yeah, sure. So when I joined the FT a couple years ago, the company was in the middle of its full transition to the cloud. Like we decided that we don't want to run any user-facing or any critical infrastructure on premises at all. I'm a big supporter of this. I believe it's made our work much more productive, and I'd even go as far as say that I'd prefer a managed solution for any larger piece of infrastructure. If you have something like Kafka, for example, I would much rather rely on a managed solution and be the user of the product rather than the person who maintains it. And of course, a big aspect of this is the financial side. Like the financial side has to make sense, and the vendor must be able to provide a service of good quality. Because think about it in this way: we are a media company. We build products for readers. We build products for journalists. We don't want to build and manage infrastructure. Now, whether I see some services or systems that have no self-managed alternatives, I think you can always run any tool on your own, but in some cases it doesn't really make sense to do so. In most cases, especially for critical pieces of infrastructure, I would much rather be the user. I would prefer to buy something instead of build or maintain it whenever possible.
That's interesting. Usually you don't get this sort of approach. Just many people in tech that rather do their own thing than rely on something else. It's very interesting. What do you think, Chris? What's your attitude towards this?
Yeah, I think the outsourced services are good if you've got the right relationship with the vendor, and the vendor can support the right sort of SLAs that you require for business critical functions. It's great to have access to this toolbox in the sky, right? But as we were saying earlier, cost is a major factor. So because we've got access to much more choice now, we've got different scaling opportunities. We've got different choice across multi-cloud infrastructure. I think it's really important to provide the right level of due diligence when using cloud capabilities, and not just use it because it's cool. Don't just pick up and use something. I mean, we should support innovation, but we also need to ensure that the capabilities, I think, first of all, are abstracted from our core infrastructure, so that we can sort of plug in different capabilities as we want to. But we've got to consider things like portability, cost, vendor lock-in, those sorts of things, which there's many opportunities that we have in off-prem managed solutions, but there are other consequences of doing that. I mean scaling. I mean look at back in the days when we would run things like transcoding services. It was quite a justification to go and buy a few more nodes of transcoding, for instance, for video transcoding. Now you just basically just turn it on, allow it to flood, basically. But there's a cost consequence to doing it. So I think the same principles as on-prem, in terms of how we choose and operate capabilities, we should have the same principles when leveraging cloud technologies as well.
Got it. A slightly different question, to be honest, but I'm really curious if there were any events that have impacted the way you handle your infrastructure, and if there were, how did you address these events? Maybe Chris, you can start this question.
Yeah, I think we might have covered some of this a little bit earlier, but certainly the impact of COVID and the amount of people now working from home. I think credit to some of the BBC teams, they reacted really well in terms of, we talked about things like single sign-on. We already had strategies in place for things like rolling out collaboration tools like Office 365, Slack, and other things. So those things were accelerated. But what we didn't necessarily have were processes in place to get equipment to people. And what happens if you have a fault with your equipment, where pre-COVID you would walk up to the service center, they'd have a look at your laptop, and off you go again. But we've had to invent new processes for quick turnaround around technologies. Luckily, a lot of and I'm talking about our digital audience facing product infrastructure, a lot of that was already cloud-based. So I think we had, certainly within that domain, we had a lot of, our strategy was sort of there, but sort of, I think the rollout in certain areas was accelerated. I mean, things like broadcast environments, a lot of the actual broadcast infrastructure is all on-prem anyway, but then giving, I suppose, access to journalists and editorial staff, giving them remote access to tooling as well, that would have been a consideration as well. So I think that, it was really, because I don't sit in a sort of an operational delivery team. I sit more in a strategy and transformation team. It was actually nice to watch from a distance how the BBC responded to getting infrastructure, even sort of domestic infrastructure, out to colleagues across the BBC. Was really quite impressive.
Alex, would you say the same thing? I mean, like Chris said, we sort of touched upon this topic already. So if there's nothing to add, we can go on to the next question.
Maybe I can give another example. Like last week, we experienced a really serious outage. At some point, our alarms went off. Turns out ft.com is down. It's now reachable. Then it turns out that the whole lot of other websites are down as well. People start losing their minds. You don't know where the problem is. Then it turns out that our CDN provider, Fastly, is actually experiencing problems. A lot of other websites are down. I think Reddit and Stack Overflow was down. Were down as well. Like it's a massive outage, and it was a really good lesson of how you can do everything right, and then you can still have to deal with problems even though you've done everything correctly. And I think that in our interconnected world now with cloud technologies, we're going to experience a whole lot of those problems. But then this raises the question of how we react to them. When we realized where the problem with the outage was from, we couldn't do much. We just had to sit it out. Like we had to wait and make sure that we're prepared. But one of the engineers that responded to the incident actually brought an interesting point of view that the CDN was down for a while, maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, something like that. And at that point, most of our cache would be invalidated. Like the time to live of most of the content would be expired. And once the CDN is up, we will have to deal with an influx of requests that will reach our servers. And as I mentioned, we rely heavily on our CDN. Like at peak times, it soaks 90% of the traffic. So we couldn't just sit idly. We had to scale our services and be ready to take the traffic. When the CDN went up, we experienced a spike, but thankfully we were ready for it. And yeah, it was a really good example of how you don't know where the problem is going to come from, and you can't do anything about this kind of infrastructure. Like we rely heavily on this service. We can't change anything. We just have to monitor and do everything in our hands to stay up.
Okay. Now, I'm not sure if this is a topic that you guys prefer to talk about the most, but can you tell us anything about how let's focus more on GDPR, because we're all located in Europe. Did the GDPR change the way you operate? Because I'm in marketing, I'm pretty sure for me it changed everything. How did it work in tech? Alex, you want to take this one, or Chris? Who's first?
Sure. I don't have a lot to say to be honest, but I've been on the receiving end on a few GDPR erasure requests in the past year, and I would say that it takes time for our systems to become fully capable of automating such things. Like we've built for many years without keeping in mind the fact that sometimes we'll have to go and delete stuff on our production databases, and this is always a risk. So it's definitely taken some resources away from regular work and product work to make sure we're compliant. Yeah, we just had to build, some additional tools and ways to automate things like erasure requests, and to make sure that we're fully compliant. And also, it changes the way UI. It changes the way UI development is done, because now when you collect or a certain kind of data, when you track users in a certain way, you have to notify them using one of those obnoxious banners that you see every time you open a website. I have a real problem with those. Like I just can't stand them. I think we've done a good job into making ours as inobtrusive as possible, but I just long for the days when this becomes a browser level setting and you don't have to get hammered with a bunch of model windows every time you open a website.
What do you think, Chris? Did you notice that?
I share the same frustration as Alex. But the BBC's had sort of centralizes a lot of this processing, and I don't think the impact was too great, really. It was really well managed. I think one thing I'd say is that being transparent is really good. If we sort of change the topic a little bit to personal data, rather than specifically to GDPR, I think it's really important that we are transparent about how we're using users' data, because we've got new forms of personal data coming in under different modalities, such as we did some pilots around voice over the last 18 months, and your voice is just a different beast in terms of personal data, in terms of how you capture it, how you process it, how you use it. Is obviously everything has to be opt-in, as Alex says, and that's still the case for that type of data. But it's all really valuable data. So being transparent about how we use it, how we store it, is interesting. But also taking into things like machine learning is to realize that machine learning only gets better by contributing data back into the models. So we also have to consider, well, how do we do that? So it's all well and good leveraging, ML from our different cloud providers and other vendors, but it's also, if we've got companies like the FT, like the BBC, who have a huge amount of user data, is how are we as transparent as possible, but also looking at ways about how we can ask permission for some of that data to be used in a responsible way to improve things like machine learning models and those sorts of things. So we're sort of moving into an interesting time where choice and opt-in is very important, because to improve your services, you're going to want to opt in. To improve the way that we give you things like recommendations and use your data to give you the best, sort of personalized or hyper-personalized service is, it is really important. So I think generally transparency so that people can see how we're responsibly storing, processing, using data is just generally a good thing. We shouldn't, if we're hiding behind it, then we're obviously doing things with that data we shouldn't be doing. And I think you see some companies, they might be doing that.
And I think Alex already responded. Did it take a lot from your development resources? I mean, did you have to build new things, Chris, or was it relatively easy to manage?
From where I was looking, it was very, very well managed. I wasn't involved in the detail with the teams, because they're the operational teams. But clearly with a lot of people, it was a bit of a headache, really. It was a bit of a diversion from doing something a bit more interesting, I suspect, for those teams, but it was just something that had to be done. So yeah, teams coordinated it well from what I could see.
All right, we have 3 more minutes. I think this is a pretty difficult question. So maybe Chris, as it's a 10 years old question and you have 20 years of experience, I believe maybe you should start with it. Can you tell us if there were what were the biggest architectural changes from the past 10 years? I'm really, really curious to hear your take on that. I think this is the last question. Afterwards, I'm not sure if we're going to have time to take more, but Chris, what do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think there are certain I'd say, rather than, I suppose, if you want to call them architectures, things like I suppose event-driven architectures, things like microservices are interesting. They change the way that we implement certain things, but I do, it does to a certain degree allow us to outsource certain things. Having those managed services, I think, is really good, but that I'm a little bit skeptical. I do believe in them and they're the right thing to do, and it's good, but I do worry about outsourcing resilience. I think we shouldn't just outsource it and forget about it. I think that we have, I come from a broadcast background, and majority of that is typically on-prem. You're worrying about a resilience of about 5 nines, and you basically design for, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So plan for the worst, hope for the best. So don't just plan for the best outcome. So I think it's great to leverage these new capabilities that we can use to make our lives easier and help us scale. But we've certainly seen an uptake in things like microservices, which is more of it's an architecture but an approach. I think is a really good way of looking at how we build our capabilities and how they're sort of bounded, well-defined, scoped areas. So, I think that if we sort of take that approach and we really sort of double down on that approach, then in the future, it would be great to see new capabilities and functions that are just an assembly rather than being written from scratch. And I think that's sort of one of the newer things that really interests me, to be honest.
So, Alex, we've heard event-driven architecture, microservices, managed services, and so on. Do you think there's anything else that we should mention?
Maybe I can, I completely agree with this. Maybe I can give like a couple different angles on the microservices and event-driven architectures pattern. I briefly mentioned microfrontends at first. I think that this is an amazing approach that is still not mature enough, but in time it will help UI development a lot. When you think about it, we already split monolithic applications into smaller services, and we're starting to experience the same problems in UI development when you've got many React engineers, for example, working on the same code base. And many times I've wished that I could just split out in the different pages or the different sections into separate applications and then group them all together. And I think that this is that this is a new approach that is going to gain a lot of traction in the upcoming years as the tooling and the libraries and the technologies in the UI ecosystem evolve. And then event streaming, I've been really happy with this. Like most people are familiar with the benefits, scalability, less coupling, fault tolerance, but it has actually helped us a lot when it comes to rewriting legacy software. We used Amazon's Event Bridge to help us split an old monolithic application into microservices. We had, most times when you're doing a rewrite, you have to support the old product and build the new one at the same time. And you have the people working on the new infrastructure. They are always in the position of those that are trying to keep up, because the business doesn't stop. Small things need to be implemented. New features are added on the old stack, and the people working on the new system are always just like trying to catch up, trying to just get it to a state when they have feature parity. And in our case, what we decided to do was just every time there is a request to implement something new, we would just fire off an event from the legacy, and we would implement it in the new stack. And that allowed us to like streamline this process a lot more. So yeah, I fully agree with Chris.
Okay, thank you, Alex and Chris. Thank you so much once again, and yeah, talk to you soon. Have a great week, both of you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.